"Ma'am, you need to watch where you're going," the man said, loud enough for the whole diner to hear, even though it was his coffee that had spilled, not hers. The bell above the glass door had barely stopped ringing when the tension settled in like humidity on a July afternoon, thick and invisible, but impossible to ignore, and Mrs. Evelyn Carter stood there with a damp cloth in her hand, her uniform a faded shade of blue that had seen too many years and too many stains to count, the faint scent of bleach clinging to her sleeves as if it had become part of her skin, her posture slightly bent but steady, like someone who had learned long ago how to carry weight without letting it show. The coffee dripped slowly from the edge of the table onto the checkered floor, each drop louder than it should have been, and the man, Derek Collins, though no one there needed to know his name to understand the kind of presence he carried, looked down at the dark stain spreading across his polished shoes as if it were a personal insult, his jaw tightening, his lips curling into something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite amusement, but something colder, something practiced. "You people always mess things up," he added, quieter this time, but somehow sharper, like a blade meant for close range, and a few heads turned away, not wanting to be part of whatever was unfolding, while others watched just enough to say later that they had seen it coming. Evelyn didn't respond right away, her eyes lowering to the spill, her hands moving with careful precision as she dabbed at the mess, the cloth absorbing what it could while leaving behind a faint ring that would need a second pass, her movements slow but deliberate, as if each motion had been measured years ago and never needed to change. Outside, a truck rumbled past, its engine vibrating through the thin diner walls, and inside, the overhead lights flickered once before settling into their usual steady hum, casting a pale glow over everything, flattening colors, turning faces into quiet masks. Derek let out a short laugh, the kind that didn't come from humor but from expectation, like he was waiting for something more, something louder, something that would justify the attention he had already claimed, and when it didn't come, he leaned in slightly, close enough for the scent of his cologne to cut through the air, sharp and expensive, out of place in a room that smelled like bacon grease and old coffee. "Did you hear me?" he said, tapping the table with 2 fingers, each tap echoing just enough to make it feel like a countdown. And still, Evelyn didn't rush, didn't flinch, didn't offer the kind of apology he seemed to be waiting for. Instead, she lifted her gaze just enough to meet his, her eyes calm in a way that didn't match the situation, not defiant, not fearful, just steady, like she was seeing something beyond him, something he couldn't quite reach, and for a brief second, something in his expression faltered, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough to shift the air between them. A young waitress near the counter paused mid-step, her tray hovering in her hands, unsure whether to intervene or disappear, while an older man in the corner folded his newspaper a little slower than before, his eyes lingering just long enough to catch the exchange before dropping back to the print, as if it were safer there. Evelyn wrung the cloth once, the water dripping back into the small bucket at her feet, and then, in a voice so soft it almost blended with the hum of the lights, she said, "Someone taught you wrong." The words simple, almost gentle, but carrying a weight that didn't need volume to be felt. Derek blinked, just once, as if recalibrating, and then the smile returned, tighter now, edged with something less controlled, something that suggested he wasn't used to being met with anything other than submission or silence, and the room seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see which direction the moment would tilt. He straightened slightly, adjusting the cuff of his shirt as if reclaiming space, and glanced around, making sure the audience was still there, still watching, because moments like this meant more when they were witnessed, when they could be replayed later as proof of something he believed he owned. Evelyn turned back to the table, continuing her work as if nothing had shifted, as if the world hadn't narrowed down to this one interaction, and for a second, it almost felt like it might pass, like the tension might dissolve into the ordinary rhythm of clinking plates and quiet conversations. But Derek didn't step back, and his hand stayed on the table a little longer than necessary. The cloth moved in slow circles across the table, but the stain did not disappear completely, just softened at the edges, like something that refused to be erased, and Evelyn Carter did not rush it, did not press harder than necessary, because she had learned that some marks only spread when forced, and Derek Collins watched her with a growing impatience that curled at the corners of his mouth, his fingers still resting on the table, drumming once, then stopping, as if even that small rhythm was beneath him. "You think that fixes it?" he said, tilting his head slightly, his voice low enough now that it felt more personal, more pointed, the kind of tone meant to draw someone in rather than push them away, and yet it carried a weight that made the air feel thinner. Evelyn set the cloth down for a moment, her hand hovering above the table as if deciding whether the job was done, then lifting it again with quiet certainty, her movements unchanged, unaffected by the shift in his voice, and for a second, it was almost as if she had not heard him at all. The bell above the door chimed again as someone entered, a gust of cooler air slipping in with them, brushing against the back of Evelyn's neck, but Derek did not turn, did not acknowledge the new presence. His focus locked where he believed it belonged, on the woman in front of him who refused to react the way he expected. "I asked you something," he continued, this time tapping the table again, a little sharper, the sound cutting through the low murmur of the diner, and a man at the counter glanced over before quickly looking away, pretending to be more interested in his plate than the tension unfolding a few feet away. Evelyn finally paused, not abruptly, but with the kind of stillness that came from completion, as if she had finished what she set out to do, whether it met anyone else's standards or not, and she placed the cloth neatly on the edge of the table, smoothing it once with her fingers before lifting her gaze again. "It makes it cleaner than before," she said, her voice even, not defensive, not apologetic, just stating something simple and true, and for a moment, Derek seemed caught between responses, as if the answer did not fit any of the reactions he had prepared. A faint clink of silverware sounded from somewhere behind them, followed by the soft scrape of a chair against tile, and the overhead lights hummed steadily, filling the silence that stretched just a second longer than comfortable. Derek exhaled through his nose, a short, controlled breath, and leaned back slightly, his chair creaking under the shift, his eyes narrowing as he studied her, searching for something he could use, some sign of weakness or hesitation that would give him back the control he felt slipping in small, almost imperceptible ways. "You are not very good at this, are you?" he said, gesturing vaguely toward the table, the floor, the entire space, as if it all fell under her responsibility, and Evelyn followed the motion with her eyes for just a moment before returning her attention to him, her expression unchanged, her shoulders relaxed in a way that suggested she was not carrying his words with her. "I have been doing this a long time," she replied, and there was no pride in it, no bitterness either, just a quiet acknowledgement of time passing, of days repeating until they blurred into something steady and familiar. Near the window, a young boy swung his legs under his seat, his sneakers tapping lightly against the metal rung of the chair, his gaze fixed on Evelyn with a kind of curiosity that had not yet learned to look away, and his mother gently touched his arm, a silent reminder to face his plate, but he hesitated, just for a second longer. Derek noticed the glance, the attention shifting, and something in his posture straightened again, as if reminded of the audience he had nearly forgotten, and his lips curved into that same thin smile, the one that did not reach his eyes. "Then maybe it is time you learned to do it right," he said, his voice lifting slightly, enough for others to hear again, enough to reclaim the space he believed was his, and Evelyn's hand moved to pick up the small bucket at her feet, the handle cool against her fingers, the water inside sloshing gently as she lifted it, a soft sound that seemed louder in the quiet that followed. She stepped back, half a pace, creating just a little distance, not retreating, just adjusting, and for a moment, it looked like she might turn away, might move on to the next table, the next task, the next small piece of a long day, but she did not, and Derek's eyes tracked that hesitation, that almost movement, as if it were something he could seize. The waitress near the counter shifted her weight from one foot to the other, her grip tightening slightly on the tray she still held, her knuckles paling just enough to show the tension she was trying to hide, and the older man with the newspaper lowered it a fraction, his eyes peering over the top now, no longer pretending not to see. Evelyn adjusted her grip on the bucket, the metal handle creaking softly, and then she looked at Derek again, not up at him, not down, just directly, the same calm, steady gaze that had unsettled him before, and the room seemed to lean in without moving, as if something was about to tip. Derek's fingers curled slightly against the table, his patience thinning in ways he was not used to managing, and the faintest flicker of irritation crossed his face before settling back into something more controlled, more deliberate, and he leaned forward again, closing the small space she had created, his voice dropping once more, quieter now, but heavier. "I am not finished with you," he said, each word placed carefully, like pieces on a board he expected to win. Evelyn did not step back this time. The words hung in the air longer than they should have, not loud, not sharp, but deliberate, like something placed exactly where it was meant to land, and Evelyn Carter did not answer them right away, her fingers still wrapped around the metal handle of the bucket, the cool edge pressing lightly into her palm as the water inside settled from its earlier movement, a faint ripple catching the overhead light before going still again. Derek Collins remained leaning forward, his presence filling the narrow space between them, his eyes fixed on her as if waiting for a reaction he could shape, something he could control, but there was nothing immediate, nothing sudden, only the quiet steadiness that had begun to unsettle him in ways he did not fully understand. A car passed outside, its headlights sliding briefly across the diner windows, casting a moving reflection that drifted over the tables and across Evelyn's face before disappearing, and for a second, the room felt like it had shifted, like the moment had stretched just enough to make everyone aware of it. Evelyn adjusted her grip on the bucket, not tightening, not loosening, just settling into it. And then she spoke, her voice calm and even, the kind that did not rise to meet tension but seemed to move through it instead. "I am working," she said, simple, direct, not defensive, and she glanced down briefly at the floor where a few drops of coffee had spread near Derek's chair, her eyes following the shape of them as if they mattered more than the words he had just spoken. Derek let out a quiet breath, not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh, and straightened slightly, his shoulders pulling back as if he needed more space, more control, and he looked around again, checking the room, confirming the silent attention that had gathered without anyone admitting to it. The young waitress near the counter had not moved, her tray still in her hands, though her arms had lowered just enough to ease the strain, and the older man with the newspaper now held it folded in his lap, no longer pretending to read, his gaze steady but careful, like someone who had seen moments like this before and knew how they could turn. Derek's lips pressed together briefly before parting again, his expression shifting into something more composed, more measured, as if he had decided to take a different approach, one that required less force and more precision. "Then you can work on this," he said, gesturing toward his shoe with a small tilt of his head, the polished leather now marked by a faint, uneven stain, not large, not dramatic, but enough for him to make it something more. Evelyn's eyes followed the gesture, resting there for a moment, taking in the detail, the contrast between the dark material and the lighter edge of the spill, and she did not move immediately, did not bend, did not reach for the cloth again, and the pause, though brief, was enough to draw attention, enough to make Derek's fingers curl slightly against the table once more. Somewhere behind them, a coffee pot clicked as it settled back onto its warmer, the soft sound blending into the low hum of the room, and the boy by the window had stopped swinging his legs, his feet now still, his gaze fixed in a way that suggested he was trying to understand something he had not seen before. Evelyn shifted her weight slightly, the soles of her shoes making a faint sound against the tile, and she lowered the bucket carefully to the floor beside her, the handle settling with a soft metallic touch, and then she straightened, not fully, but enough to meet Derek's height a little more directly, her posture steady, her expression unchanged. "That is not my job," she said, and the words were not sharp, not challenging, just clear, like a line drawn without needing to be emphasized, and for a moment, the room seemed to lean in again, the quiet stretching just enough to make the sentence feel larger than it was. Derek's eyes narrowed, not in surprise, but in calculation, as if he were adjusting to a variable he had not expected, and the corner of his mouth lifted slightly, though the smile did not settle fully this time, held back by something less certain. He glanced down at his shoe, then back at her, as if weighing the response, deciding how to reshape the moment into something that still belonged to him. The waitress took a small step forward, then stopped, her foot hovering for just a second before settling back, uncertainty anchoring her in place, and the older man shifted in his seat, the faint creak of wood under him sounding louder than it should have in the stillness. Derek leaned forward again, slower this time, his movement controlled, deliberate, his voice lowering as he spoke, not for privacy, but for emphasis, each word placed with intention. "Everything in here is your job," he said, and there was something in the way he said it that suggested he believed it. Not just about the diner, but about the space, the people, the moment itself, as if it all existed within a structure he understood and expected others to follow. Evelyn held his gaze, her eyes steady, not hard, not soft, just present, and the light above them flickered once more before settling again, casting the same pale glow over both of them, flattening the difference in their expressions, but not the distance between them. The bucket at her feet was still, the water inside completely calm now, reflecting a faint, distorted image of the ceiling, and for a second, it felt like everything had paused, like the next movement, the next word, would decide something larger than either of them had intended. Derek's hand lifted slightly from the table, not fully, just enough to break contact, his fingers hovering in the air as if considering what to do next. Derek's fingers hovered in the air for a fraction longer, then slowly lowered back to the table, not with the same casual rhythm as before, but with a quieter intention, as if something in the exchange had shifted just enough to make him reconsider the pace of his own movements, and the faint sound of his knuckles brushing the surface seemed louder than it should have been in the stillness that had settled around them. Evelyn Carter did not move, her posture unchanged, her hands relaxed at her sides now that the bucket rested on the floor, the metal handle leaning gently against its rim, and the reflection in the water remained undisturbed, a pale mirror of the ceiling lights above, steady and unbroken. The room held that silence carefully, like something fragile that no one wanted to be the first to disrupt, and even the low hum of the appliances seemed softer, as if the diner itself had drawn a quiet breath. Derek tilted his head slightly, studying her again, but this time there was less certainty in his expression, less of that practiced control, replaced by something more deliberate, more watchful, like he was trying to understand a pattern that did not follow the rules he expected. "You are serious," he said, not quite a question, not quite a statement, the words landing somewhere in between, and Evelyn's gaze remained steady, meeting his without force, without retreat, just present in a way that did not invite escalation but did not yield to it either. Near the counter, the waitress finally set her tray down, the soft clink of plates against the surface breaking the tension just enough to remind everyone that the world outside this moment still existed, that orders still needed to be filled, that coffee still needed to be poured, but no one moved to follow through, not yet. Derek exhaled slowly, his shoulders rising and falling in a controlled motion, and he leaned back in his chair, creating space again, but not releasing the moment entirely, his eyes never leaving Evelyn's face, as if he expected something else to surface, some reaction delayed, some sign that would confirm his understanding of how things were supposed to work. "You really think you get to decide that?" he said, his voice quieter now, less performative, more focused, and for a second, it felt like the words were meant only for her, not for the room, not for the audience that had gathered without acknowledgement. Evelyn glanced briefly toward the window, where the fading afternoon light had shifted into a softer tone, casting long reflections across the glass, and then she looked back at him, her expression unchanged, her presence steady in a way that did not require explanation. "I decide what I do," she replied, and the simplicity of it seemed to settle into the space between them, not heavy, not forceful, just firm enough to remain. Derek's jaw tightened slightly, the smallest movement, but enough to suggest that the response had not landed where he expected, and he looked down again at his shoe, at the faint stain that had started all of this, as if reassessing its importance, its role in the moment, and for the first time, it seemed smaller, less significant than the space it had taken up. A chair shifted softly somewhere behind him, and the older man stood halfway before sitting back down again, as if reconsidering his own involvement, his hands folding together in his lap, his attention still fixed on the scene. The boy by the window leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on the table now, his curiosity no longer hidden, and his mother did not pull him back this time, her own gaze lingering, quiet but present. Derek ran a hand along the edge of the table, his fingers tracing the worn surface, the small imperfections in the wood catching briefly against his skin, and he let out another breath. This one less controlled, less measured, as if something in the rhythm he had been maintaining was beginning to slip. "You know," he said, his tone shifting again, searching for a different angle, something that would restore the balance he was used to. "Most people would just do it and move on." And the words carried a hint of expectation, a suggestion of how things usually worked, how they were supposed to work. Evelyn's eyes softened just slightly, not in agreement, not in concession, but in recognition, as if she understood the pattern he was describing, the routine he relied on, and she gave a small nod, not to him, but to the idea itself. "Most people do," she said, and there was no judgment in it, no criticism, just an acknowledgement of what was common, what was expected, and the difference between that and what she had chosen. The light above them flickered once more, then steadied, casting the same even glow across both of them, and the reflection in the bucket remained still, unchanged, holding the quiet of the moment within it. Derek's gaze returned to her, sharper now, not louder, not more aggressive, but more focused, as if he had decided that this was not over, that there was still something unresolved, something he needed to push further to understand or to control. He leaned forward again, slower this time, his movement deliberate, his presence narrowing the space once more, and his voice dropped just enough to pull the moment back into something more private, more contained. "Then maybe you are not like most people," he said, and the words lingered between them, not quite an insult, not quite a compliment, but something that carried its own weight, its own implication, and Evelyn did not look away. The words settled between them like something that did not need to be repeated, and Evelyn Carter held his gaze for a moment longer before letting it soften, not in surrender, not in agreement, but in a quiet acknowledgement that the moment had already said more than either of them intended, and she reached down to adjust the bucket at her feet, her fingers brushing the cool metal as she shifted it slightly to the side, clearing the narrow space between them without stepping away. Derek Collins watched the movement closely, as if expecting it to signal something else, some retreat or concession, but when it did not, when she simply straightened again with the same calm steadiness, his expression tightened just enough to reveal the strain beneath his composure. The overhead lights hummed softly, casting a pale glow that flattened the room into shades of muted color, and the reflection in the diner window showed the faint outline of passing cars, their headlights, streaking briefly across the glass before fading into the distance. A waitress moved behind the counter, slower than before, her hands careful as she refilled a coffee pot, the dark liquid pouring in a steady stream that sounded louder in the quiet. And somewhere near the back, a chair scraped lightly against the floor before going still again. Derek leaned back once more, but this time it was not to create space. It was to study, his eyes narrowing slightly as he looked at Evelyn, as if she were something unfamiliar, something that did not fit into the pattern he relied on, and he let out a small breath, almost thoughtful, though the tension in his shoulders remained. "You really believe that matters," he said, his voice quieter now, less sharp, but carrying a different kind of weight, one that suggested he was not asking for an answer so much as testing the idea itself. Evelyn glanced briefly at the table, at the faint mark that remained despite her effort, then back at him, her expression unchanged, her presence steady in a way that did not require explanation. "It matters to me," she said, and the words were simple, almost soft, but they held in the air with a clarity that did not fade. Derek's gaze lingered on her face, searching again, not for weakness this time, but for something else, something he could not quite name, and for a second, the edge of his confidence seemed to dull, replaced by a quieter uncertainty that he quickly masked with a small shift in posture, his hand moving to adjust the sleeve of his shirt as if reclaiming control through habit. The boy by the window leaned forward a little more, his chin resting in his hand now, his eyes fixed on Evelyn with a kind of quiet focus, and his mother did not stop him, her own attention caught in the same stillness that had settled over the room. The older man in the corner exhaled slowly, folding his hands together as he watched, his expression thoughtful, as if he were remembering something, or perhaps recognizing it. Derek tapped the table once, a single, controlled motion, then stopped, his fingers resting flat against the surface, and he glanced down again at his shoe, at the faint stain that had become less about the mark itself and more about what it represented, and for a moment, It seemed as though he might let it go, might stand up, might walk away and leave the moment where it was. But he did not move, and instead, he leaned forward again, slower this time, his presence narrowing the space between them once more, his voice dropping just enough to pull the moment inward. "You are making this harder than it needs to be," he said, and there was something in the way he said it that suggested he believed he was offering a solution, a way out, even if it was one that only made sense to him. Evelyn's eyes remained steady, her shoulders relaxed, her hands still at her sides, and she gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head, not dismissive, not defiant, just certain. "No," she said, and the word was quiet, but it did not waver. The silence that followed was different from before, less fragile, more settled, as if something had shifted beneath the surface, something that did not need to be seen to be felt, and Derek's gaze held on hers for a moment longer before flicking briefly to the side, to the room, to the people who had not looked away, and when his eyes returned, there was a subtle change, not in intensity, but in direction, as if he had begun to realize that the moment was no longer entirely his to shape. The coffee pot clicked softly as it was set back in place, the waitress stepping away from the counter with careful movements, her attention divided between her tasks and the space where the tension remained, and the hum of the lights continued, steady and unbroken, filling the quiet with something constant. Evelyn shifted her weight slightly, not stepping back, not moving forward, just adjusting, and her gaze held, calm and unwavering, and for a brief second, it felt as though the entire room had aligned around that stillness, that quiet refusal to bend. Derek's hand lifted again, not fully, just enough to hover, his fingers curling slightly as if he were about to act, about to say something that would change the direction of everything that had led to this point. His fingers hovered just above the table, not quite forming a gesture, not quite retreating, caught in that small space between intention and decision, and Evelyn Carter did not flinch, did not shift her stance or brace for anything, her presence remaining steady in a way that made the moment feel longer than it was, like time had slowed just enough for everyone in the room to notice it. Derek Collins let his hand fall back down, not with force, not with frustration, but with a controlled motion that suggested he was choosing restraint rather than losing it, and he leaned back again, exhaling through his nose as if resetting something inside himself. The faint scent of coffee still lingered in the air, mixed with the sharper trace of cleaning solution from Evelyn's uniform, the two smells blending into something oddly balanced, like the space itself could not decide which one defined it more. Behind the counter, the waitress finally moved again, picking up the coffee pot and stepping toward a nearby table, her footsteps quiet but purposeful, as if she were trying to restore a sense of normalcy that had been paused rather than broken. Evelyn glanced briefly toward the door, where the glass reflected the dimming light outside, the late afternoon slipping toward evening, and for a moment, her eyes seemed to soften in a way that had nothing to do with Derek, something quieter, something inward, like a thought passing through that she did not need to share. Derek followed the direction of her gaze without turning his head, just shifting his eyes slightly, and then he looked back at her, his expression less certain now, less defined by the sharp edges he had carried earlier. "You are really going to stand there," he said, his voice lower, almost thoughtful, as if he were still trying to understand the shape of her response, or lack of one, and Evelyn gave a small nod, not in defiance, not in agreement, but simply as an acknowledgement of the present moment. "I am already standing," she replied, her tone even, the words simple enough to sound almost like a quiet observation rather than an answer, and for a second, Derek's lips parted as if to respond, but no words came immediately, as if the expected exchange had shifted just enough to leave him searching for a different approach. The boy by the window straightened slightly, his attention unwavering now, his eyes moving between them with a focus that suggested he was trying to piece together something important, while his mother remained still, her hands folded loosely on the table, her gaze steady but calm, not intervening, not turning away. Evelyn reached for the cloth again, not hurried, not hesitant, just continuing her work as if the moment allowed for it, her fingers smoothing it once before placing it against the table, wiping the remaining edge of the stain with the same careful motion as before, and the quiet sound of fabric against what seemed to settle into the space. grounding it in something familiar. Derek watched her, his head tilting slightly, his eyes narrowing just enough to suggest he was no longer looking for a reaction, but for meaning, something beneath the surface of what she was doing, something that explained why she had not stepped back, why she had not complied, why she had not escalated. "You do not seem upset," he said, and the words came slower this time, less certain, more like an observation than a challenge, and Evelyn paused briefly, the cloth still in her hand, her gaze lowering to the table before lifting again. "I have had long days," she said, and there was something in the way she said it that carried more than the words themselves, not heavy, not dramatic, just layered, like a history that did not need to be explained to be understood, and Derek's expression shifted again, the sharpness softening into something quieter, something that did not quite fit with the posture he had been holding. A car door closed outside, the sound muted through the glass, followed by the faint crunch of footsteps on gravel, and the bell above the diner door trembled slightly, though it did not ring, as if someone had paused just outside. Evelyn continued wiping the table, her movements steady, unbroken, and when she finished, she lifted the cloth and folded it neatly in her hands, her fingers smoothing the edges with a small, practiced motion. Derek's gaze dropped to the table, to the space where the stain had been, now barely visible, just a faint shadow if one looked closely enough, and he ran his fingers lightly over the surface, as if testing whether it was truly gone, whether the moment could be reduced to something that simple. The waitress returned to the counter, setting down the coffee pot with a soft click, and the older man shifted again in his seat, his attention still fixed on the quiet exchange that had replaced the earlier tension with something less obvious, but no less present. Derek looked back at Evelyn, his expression now more measured than before, less about control and more about understanding, though the two still sat close together in his posture, and he leaned forward just slightly, not closing the space entirely this time, just enough to remain engaged. "You talk like this is nothing," he said, and the words carried a different tone now, less sharp, more searching, and Evelyn held his gaze for a moment before giving a small, almost gentle shake of her head. "It is not nothing," she said, her voice calm, her words steady, and for a brief second, the room seemed to pause again, not in tension, but in recognition, as if something had been named without being fully explained. Derek's eyes lingered on her face, the uncertainty there now more visible, more present, and his hand rested still on the table, no longer tapping, no longer hovering, just there, as if he had forgotten what he intended to do with it. Outside, the light shifted again, dimming slightly as the sun lowered, and the reflection in the window deepened, turning the glass into a darker mirror of the room inside, and for a moment, it felt like everything had settled into a quiet balance that could tip in either direction. The bell above the door gave a soft, unexpected ring. The soft ring of the bell did not carry urgency, but it carried attention, the kind that shifted the air just enough for people to notice without knowing why, and Evelyn Carter's eyes moved toward the door again, not quickly, not sharply, just naturally, as if she had been expecting something to arrive at its own pace. The glass door eased open, letting in a thin ribbon of cooler evening air, and a man stepped inside, his movements unhurried, his posture straight but not stiff, dressed simply in a dark coat that seemed out of place only because it was too clean for a diner like this, too deliberate, like it belonged somewhere quieter, somewhere more controlled. He paused just inside, letting the door close behind him with a soft click, and for a moment, he did not move forward, his gaze sweeping the room in a calm, measured way, not searching, not scanning, just noticing. Derek Collins glanced toward the door without fully turning, his attention pulled by the subtle shift in the room rather than the man himself, and then his eyes returned to Evelyn, as if unwilling to let go of the moment he had been shaping, though something in his posture adjusted slightly, almost imperceptibly. Evelyn held the cloth in her hands, now folded neatly, her fingers resting lightly against it, and her expression did not change when she saw the man, but there was a stillness in her gaze that felt different from before, not tense, not reactive, just aware in a deeper way, like a note held just beneath the surface. The man took a few steps forward, his shoes making a quiet, steady sound against the tile, and the waitress near the counter straightened slightly as he passed, her eyes flicking toward him before returning to her work, though her movement slowed, as if she were listening for something she could not yet name. Derek leaned back again, his hand resting flat on the table, his fingers no longer tapping, no longer hovering, and he followed the man's movement now with a more direct glance, his eyes narrowing just enough to register the difference, the presence that did not announce itself but did not need to. "Looks like you are getting company," Derek said, his voice low, carrying a faint edge of something between curiosity and dismissal, and Evelyn did not respond immediately, her gaze remaining steady on the man as he moved closer, not toward them exactly, but into the space that connected everything in the room. The older man in the corner shifted slightly, his posture straightening as he watched, his hands resting on his knees now, no longer folded, and the boy by the window leaned forward again, his attention drawn to the new arrival in a way that felt instinctive rather than learned. The man stopped near the counter, not ordering, not speaking, just standing there for a moment, his presence settling into the room like something that belonged, even if no one could say why. And then his eyes lifted, not quickly, not sharply, just gradually, until they met Evelyn's across the space. It was not a long look, not intense, not dramatic, just a brief connection, a quiet acknowledgement that passed between them without drawing attention, and then he looked away, as if nothing had happened at all. Derek noticed it, though, the small exchange, the glance that did not fit into the pattern he had been following, and his expression shifted again, the uncertainty returning in a more defined way, as if a piece of the moment had moved outside his reach. "Friend of yours?" he asked, his tone lighter now, almost casual, but the question lingered in a way that suggested it carried more weight than he intended to show. Evelyn lowered her gaze briefly to the table, to the space where the stain had been, now barely visible, and then she looked back at Derek, her expression calm, her voice steady. "He knows how to listen," she said, and the words were simple, but they did not answer the question directly, and Derek's lips pressed together slightly, as if deciding whether to push further or let it pass. The man at the counter turned slightly, his attention shifting to a menu on the wall, his posture relaxed, his presence unchanged, and the waitress approached him carefully, her voice soft as she asked if he needed anything, her tone carrying a subtle respect that had not been there before. Derek watched this, his gaze moving between the man and Evelyn, trying to connect something that had not yet formed, and his hand lifted slightly from the table again, not in frustration this time, but in hesitation, as if he were reconsidering the direction of everything that had led to this point. Evelyn remained where she was, her hands still, her posture steady, her gaze no longer fixed on Derek but not fully turned away either, holding the moment in a quiet balance that did not need to be explained. The light outside dimmed further, the reflections in the window deepening, and the hum of the diner settled into something softer, something more contained, as if the room itself had adjusted to the presence of something new. Derek leaned forward again, slower than before, his voice dropping slightly as he spoke, not to dominate the space, but to keep it. "You seem very sure of yourself," he said, and there was less edge in it now, more curiosity, more uncertainty, and Evelyn's eyes met his once more, calm and unwavering, her voice quiet but clear. "I am sure of what matters," she said, and the words lingered between them, not loud, not forceful, just present in a way that did not fade. Derek's gaze held on hers, searching again, but this time without the same confidence, without the same control, and his hand remained suspended for a moment before settling back down, still and uncertain, as if he had forgotten what he meant to do next. The man at the counter did not turn, did not look back, but his presence seemed to fill the space anyway, subtle and steady, like a quiet shift that no one could ignore, and for the first time since the moment began, Derek did not speak immediately, his silence stretching just enough to feel unfamiliar. Something about the room had changed, even if no one said it out loud. The quiet that followed did not feel empty. It felt occupied, like something unseen had stepped into the space and settled between them, and Derek Collins shifted slightly in his seat, not enough to draw attention, but enough to release a tension he had not realized he was holding, his fingers sliding across the table's surface before resting again, flat and still. Evelyn Carter did not move, her posture unchanged, her hands loosely holding the folded cloth, her gaze steady but no longer fixed entirely on Derek. as if her awareness had widened to include the room, the man at the counter, the subtle changes that had begun to ripple outward without anyone naming them. The man remained near the counter, his presence quiet, his attention seemingly on the menu above, though there was something in the stillness of his stance that suggested he was not distracted, just patient, and the waitress stood beside him with a small notepad, waiting without speaking, her usual rhythm replaced by a careful pause. Derek followed the scene with a slight tilt of his head, his eyes narrowing as he tried to read something that did not present itself clearly, and he leaned forward just a fraction, his voice lower now, less certain. "You talk like things are already decided," he said, and the words carried a different tone than before, not confrontational, but probing, as if he were trying to understand a rule he had not been taught. Evelyn glanced toward the counter again, her eyes resting briefly on the man before returning to Derek, her expression calm, her voice even. "Some things are," she said, and the simplicity of it seemed to settle into the space without needing explanation, and Derek's lips parted slightly, as if he meant to respond quickly, but no words came right away, his usual rhythm disrupted by something he could not quite place. A faint clatter came from the kitchen, a plate being set down or lifted, the sound echoing softly through the narrow space. And the older man in the corner leaned back slightly, his chair creaking under the shift, his gaze moving from Evelyn to the man at the counter and back again, as if he were tracing a connection that had not yet been spoken. The boy by the window had gone still again, his hands resting on the edge of the table, his eyes wide but quiet, absorbing everything without asking questions. And his mother glanced at him briefly before returning her attention to the scene, her expression thoughtful, almost cautious. Derek ran a hand along his jaw, a small, habitual motion, and then let it drop back to the table, his posture no longer as rigid, no longer as certain, and he looked at Evelyn again, this time with something closer to curiosity than control. "And what do you think is decided here?" he asked, his voice softer now, less about asserting and more about seeking, and Evelyn held his gaze for a moment before answering, her tone unchanged, her presence steady. "How people choose to be," she said, and the words lingered, not heavy, not sharp, but clear in a way that made them difficult to ignore. Derek's eyes shifted slightly, the certainty he had carried earlier replaced by a quieter consideration, and he glanced again toward the counter, toward the man who still had not spoken, still had not ordered, and yet seemed to hold a place in the room that did not need to be claimed. The waitress finally spoke to him in a low voice, asking a question that did not carry beyond their small space, and he nodded once, a small, measured motion, his voice too quiet to reach the others, and she wrote something down, her pen moving carefully across the paper. Derek watched this, his gaze lingering longer now, as if trying to understand why the interaction felt different, why the man's presence had shifted something he could not name, and he leaned back again, his shoulders easing slightly, though the tension had not disappeared, only changed. Evelyn adjusted the cloth in her hands, smoothing it once more, a small, practiced motion, and then she set it down on the edge of the table, her fingers releasing it gently, as if letting go of something that no longer needed to be held. The overhead lights flickered once, then steadied, casting the same pale glow across the room, but the shadows seemed deeper now, the reflections in the window darker, the outside world fading into evening as the inside grew more defined. Derek exhaled slowly, his gaze returning to Evelyn, and for a moment, he did not speak, the silence stretching just enough to feel intentional, as if he were choosing his next words more carefully than before. "You think that changes anything?" he said finally, his voice low, almost uncertain, and Evelyn met his gaze without hesitation, her expression calm, her voice quiet but firm. "It changes everything," she said, and the words did not rise, did not demand attention, but they settled into the room in a way that made them impossible to dismiss. Derek's hand lifted slightly again, not in anger, not in control, but in hesitation, his fingers curling loosely as if he were about to act, about to speak, about to do something that would restore the balance he had lost, but the motion stopped midway, held there for just a second longer than it should have been. The man at the counter turned his head just slightly, not fully, just enough for his profile to catch the light, and though he did not look directly at them, the shift was enough to ripple through the space, subtle but unmistakable, like a change in pressure before a storm. Derek noticed it, his eyes flicking toward the movement, and when he looked back at Evelyn, something in his expression had changed again, not completely, not dramatically, but enough to suggest that he was no longer certain of where he stood in the moment he had started. The room remained quiet, but it was no longer the same kind of quiet, and Derek's hand did not lower right away. Derek's hand remained suspended for a moment longer, the hesitation now visible not as weakness but as interruption, like a thought that refused to complete itself, and slowly, almost reluctantly, his fingers lowered back to the table, resting there without movement, without purpose, as if he had lost track of what he intended to do with them in the first place. Evelyn Carter did not shift, her posture still calm, her presence steady in a way that no longer felt passive but deliberate, like a choice made long before this moment began, and her eyes remained on Derek, not pressing, not retreating, just holding the space between them with a quiet certainty that did not need to be explained. The man at the counter adjusted slightly, his shoulders easing as he turned just enough to accept the cup of coffee the waitress placed in front of him, his fingers brushing the edge of the mug with a small, controlled motion, and he nodded once in thanks, his voice too soft to carry, but the exchange itself seemed to anchor the room in something more grounded, something that did not revolve around tension alone. Derek noticed the movement again, his gaze flicking toward the counter, then back to Evelyn, and for the first time, there was a clear break in his focus, a shift that suggested he was no longer fully in control of the moment he had started. "You keep looking over there," he said, his voice quieter now, less certain, as if he were testing the observation rather than asserting it, and Evelyn followed his glance briefly before returning her attention to him, her expression unchanged. "I look where I need to," she said, and the words were simple, but they carried a weight that did not invite further questioning, and Derek's lips pressed together slightly as he considered them, his usual rhythm of response slowed by something he could not quite define. The older man in the corner leaned forward now, his elbows resting on his knees, his gaze steady and unhidden, and the boy by the window had gone completely still, his earlier curiosity replaced by a quiet focus that suggested he understood, in some way, that this moment mattered, even if he could not yet explain why. Derek exhaled slowly, his shoulders rising and falling in a measured motion, and he leaned back in his chair once more, creating distance, not just physically, but in his posture, as if he were stepping back from something he had been too close to see clearly. "You are not afraid," he said, and this time it was not a challenge, not an accusation, just a realization spoken out loud, and Evelyn's eyes softened slightly, not in agreement, not in denial, but in acknowledgement of the observation itself. "Fear does not help me here," she replied, her voice calm, her words steady, and the simplicity of it seemed to settle into the space without resistance. Derek looked at her for a long moment, his gaze searching, not for weakness now, but for understanding, and when he did not find what he expected, he looked away briefly, his eyes drifting toward the window where the fading light had turned the glass into a darker mirror, reflecting the room back onto itself in muted shapes and softened edges. The man at the counter lifted his cup, taking a slow sip, his movements unhurried, his presence unchanged, and though he did not look toward them, there was something in the stillness of his posture that suggested he was aware, that he had been aware from the moment he stepped inside. Derek's hand moved again, this time not lifting, not hovering, but sliding slightly across the table, his fingers tracing the edge of where the stain had been, as if confirming its absence, as if grounding himself in something tangible. "Most people would have walked away by now," he said, his voice lower, more thoughtful, and Evelyn gave a small nod, not in agreement, but in recognition of the truth in the statement. "Most people are tired," she said, and there was something in the way she said it that carried a quiet understanding, not judgment, not dismissal, just acknowledgement, and Derek's gaze returned to her, sharper now, but not aggressive, more focused, more present. The waitress stepped back from the counter, her attention lingering for a moment before she turned to tend to another table, her movements careful, deliberate, as if she were trying not to disturb something that had settled into place. The older man shifted again, leaning back this time, his hands resting on the arms of his chair, his expression thoughtful, and the boy by the window finally blinked, as if breaking a spell he had not realized he was under. Derek leaned forward slightly, not closing the space entirely, just enough to remain engaged, his voice dropping again, softer than before, carrying a tone that felt less certain, less controlled. "And you are not," he said, and it was. Not quite a question, not quite a statement, but something in between, something that lingered in the air without needing to be resolved immediately. Evelyn held his gaze, her eyes steady, her expression calm, and she gave the smallest shake of her head, not dismissive, not defiant, just certain. "Not today," she said, and the words settled between them with a quiet finality that did not need to be emphasized. Derek's eyes remained on hers, the uncertainty there now more visible, more present, and for a moment, it seemed as though he might say something else, might push further, might try to reclaim the space he had lost, but the words did not come, and his hand remained still against the table, no longer searching for something to hold. The man at the counter set his cup down with a soft click, the sound barely audible, but enough to ripple through the quiet, and he adjusted his stance slightly, turning just a fraction more toward the room, not fully, not directly, but enough to shift the balance of attention once again. Derek noticed it immediately, his gaze flicking toward the movement, and when he looked back at Evelyn, something in his expression had changed again, not completely, not dramatically, but enough to suggest that the moment had moved beyond him in a way he could not control. The room remained still, but it was no longer waiting in the same way, and Derek's voice, when it came again, was quieter than it had been all evening. "Who is that?" he asked. Derek's question did not echo, but it lingered, the kind of quiet that followed it stretching just enough to make the absence of an answer feel deliberate, and Evelyn Carter did not respond right away, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, as if the question itself had already been placed where it belonged, needing no immediate reply. The man at the counter remained still for a moment longer, his hand resting lightly on the handle of his coffee cup, the faint steam rising and catching the overhead light before dissolving into the air, and then, slowly, he turned, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to face more of the room, his movement measured in a way that suggested he was not reacting, but choosing. Derek Collins followed the shift instantly, his eyes narrowing slightly as he took in the man more directly now, his attention no longer divided, no longer uncertain about where to look, and for the first time, there was a pause in his expression that did not belong to him, something unplanned, something that had not been part of the moment he believed he controlled. Evelyn's hands rested calmly at her sides, the folded cloth still where she had left it, and her gaze moved once, briefly, to the man, then back to Derek, her expression unchanged, her presence steady in a way that now felt anchored rather than quiet. "Someone who understands timing," she said, her voice even, the words simple, but they carried a weight that did not invite further explanation, and Derek's lips parted slightly, as if the answer had not satisfied him, as if it had opened something instead of closing it. The man took a step forward, then another, not toward them directly, but into the space between the counter and the tables, his presence expanding without effort, without demand, and the room seemed to adjust around him, not dramatically, not obviously, but in small, almost imperceptible ways, like a shift in balance that no one could ignore. The waitress stepped back slightly, giving him space without being asked, her eyes following his movement with a quiet attentiveness, and the older man in the corner straightened again, his posture alert now, his gaze steady, as if recognizing something that had not yet been named. Derek leaned back in his chair, just slightly, not enough to retreat, but enough to create a distance he had not needed before, his fingers pressing lightly against the table as if grounding himself, and his gaze remained fixed on the man, searching, measuring, trying to place him within a framework that no longer seemed to fit. "I did not ask for a riddle," Derek said, his voice lower now, less certain. The sharp edge softened into something more controlled, more cautious, and Evelyn's eyes met his again, calm and unwavering. "Then you should ask better questions," she replied, and the words settled between them with a quiet clarity that did not need to rise to be heard. Derek's jaw tightened slightly, the smallest movement, but enough to reveal the tension beneath his composure, and he glanced again toward the man, who had now stopped a few feet away, not intruding, not distant, simply present, his posture relaxed, his gaze steady, not confrontational, not avoiding, just aware. The overhead lights hummed softly, casting the same pale glow across all three of them, flattening shadows but not erasing the distance that had formed, and outside, the last traces of daylight faded into a deeper blue, the window now reflecting the room more clearly than the world beyond it. Evelyn shifted her weight slightly, a small, natural movement, and her gaze rested briefly on the man again, not seeking, not questioning, just acknowledging, and there was something in that brief glance that passed quietly between them, something that did not need to be spoken to be understood. Derek noticed it, the subtle exchange, and his expression changed again, the uncertainty now more defined, more present, as if the moment had moved beyond his ability to predict it. "You know him," Derek said, not as a question this time, but as a realization forming out loud, and Evelyn did not rush to answer, her silence stretching just enough to make the words settle before she spoke. "I know what he stands for," she said, and the response was not direct, not simple, but it carried a steadiness that made it difficult to dismiss. Derek's gaze flicked between them, his mind working through something he could not quite complete, and he leaned forward slightly, not to reclaim space, but to understand it, his voice quieter now, more measured. "And what is that supposed to mean?" he asked, and the words did not carry the same confidence they once had, instead holding a hint of something else, something closer to uncertainty. The man took another step, closing a small portion of the distance, and for the first time, he spoke, his voice calm, low, carrying no strain, no effort, just clarity. "It means you are still deciding who you are in this moment," he said, and the room seemed to hold that sentence differently, as if it had been placed exactly where it needed to be. Derek's eyes shifted to him fully now, the question he had asked answered in a way he had not expected, and his hand moved slightly on the table, not lifting, not retreating, just adjusting, as if recalibrating his place in something that no longer felt familiar. Evelyn remained still, her gaze steady, her presence unchanged, but the space around her felt different now, not because she had moved, but because something else had stepped into alignment with it, something that did not need to be named to be felt. Derek opened his mouth slightly, as if to respond, but the words did not come immediately, and for the first time since the moment began, he seemed to hesitate not out of control, but out of uncertainty. The man's gaze remained steady on him, not pressing, not demanding, just present, and the quiet that followed was not empty, but full, as if it carried something waiting to be chosen. Derek swallowed lightly, his posture shifting again, and the certainty he had carried earlier seemed to loosen its hold just enough to be noticed. The room did not move, but it was no longer still in the same way, and Derek's next words came slower than before. "And what if I already decided?" he said. The question lingered in the air, not sharp, not loud, but heavy in a way that made the room feel smaller around it. And Derek Collins held his gaze steady, as if the words themselves could anchor him back into control, back into something familiar, something he could define. The man did not respond immediately, his posture unchanged, his presence calm in a way that did not compete with Derek's tension, but seemed to exist outside of it, and Evelyn Carter remained still between them, her hands relaxed, her expression steady, as if she had already stepped beyond the moment Derek was still trying to hold on to. The overhead lights hummed softly, and somewhere in the kitchen, a faint clatter echoed before fading again, but no one moved, no one spoke, the entire room caught in the quiet space that followed his question. Derek shifted slightly in his chair, his fingers pressing against the edge of the table, and he let out a small breath, as if waiting for an answer that would restore the balance he believed he had lost. "Then you will have to live with that decision," the man said finally, his voice calm, measured, not raised, not forced, just clear in a way that did not invite argument, and the words settled into the space with a quiet finality that made them difficult to dismiss. Derek's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in resistance, as if he were pushing back against something he could not fully see, and he leaned forward again, not aggressively, but with intention, trying to reclaim ground that no longer felt stable beneath him. "You talk like you know me," Derek said, his voice lower now, less certain, and the man tilted his head just slightly, his gaze steady, not challenging, not dismissing, just observing. I know enough, he replied. And there was something in the simplicity of that answer that seemed to reach further than a longer explanation ever could. Evelyn's gaze moved briefly between them, her expression unchanged, but there was a quiet weight in her presence now, something that felt more defined, more grounded, as if the moment had settled into its true shape and she no longer needed to hold it together. Derek's hand lifted slightly again, not in anger, not in control, but in uncertainty, his fingers curling loosely as if he were searching for something to hold on to, and then it lowered again, resting flat against the table, still and quiet. The older man in the corner exhaled slowly, his posture easing, as if he had been waiting for something to be said, and the boy by the window blinked again, his attention still fixed, but softer now, less tense, as if the moment had shifted into something he could begin to understand. Derek looked at Evelyn, his gaze searching, not for weakness now, but for clarity, and for the first time, there was something in his expression that resembled hesitation rather than control. And you are just going to stand there and let him talk for you, he said, his voice quieter, less sharp, and Evelyn gave a small shake of her head, her eyes steady, her tone calm. No, she said, and the word was simple, but it carried a quiet certainty that did not need to be emphasized. Derek's brow furrowed slightly, the tension in his expression shifting again, and he leaned back, his shoulders easing just enough to show the change, his posture no longer rigid, no longer anchored in the same way. Then say something, he said, and this time it was not a demand, not a command, but something closer to an invitation, though it carried a weight he did not fully understand. Evelyn held his gaze for a moment, her expression calm, her presence steady, and then she spoke, her voice soft but clear, each word placed carefully. You already heard it, she said, and the simplicity of the statement seemed to settle into the space between them, not loud, not forceful, but firm in a way that did not invite contradiction. Derek's eyes shifted slightly, his focus narrowing as he tried to find something in her words that he could challenge, something he could reshape, but the usual patterns did not present themselves, and for a moment, he simply sat there, his hands still on the table, his posture no longer defined by control, but by something less certain. The man remained where he stood, his presence unchanged, his gaze steady, not pressing, not retreating, just there, and the room seemed to adjust around that stillness. The tension that had once filled it now replaced by something quieter, something more grounded. Derek exhaled again, this time slower, his shoulders dropping slightly, and he glanced briefly toward the door, as if considering something beyond the moment, something outside the space he had been trying to control. Evelyn did not move, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, and for a brief second, it felt as though the entire room had aligned around that stillness, that quiet refusal to be drawn into something smaller than what it had become. Derek looked back at her, his expression softer now, though not fully resolved, and his voice, when he spoke again, carried less certainty than before. So that is it, he said. Derek's words settled into the space without resistance, but they did not carry the weight he expected, and for a moment, he seemed to feel that shift himself, the quiet realization that what he had built the moment on was no longer holding it together. Evelyn Carter did not answer immediately, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, and the stillness around her felt less like waiting and more like completion, as if something had already been decided without needing to be spoken out loud. The man remained where he stood, his presence calm, his attention neither pressing nor withdrawing, simply there, and the room held that balance carefully, like something fragile that had finally found its place. Derek shifted in his chair, his shoulders easing slightly, the tension that had once defined his posture now replaced by something less certain, something quieter, and he glanced briefly toward the table, toward the place where the stain had been, now barely visible, as if it had never been the point at all. That is it, Evelyn said finally, her voice soft, even, not closing the moment, but acknowledging it, and the words carried a quiet finality that did not need emphasis. Derek's eyes lifted back to hers, searching again, but this time without the same urgency, without the same expectation, and for a second, it seemed as though he was looking not for an answer, but for something to hold on to, something that would make sense of the shift he could not quite explain. You are just going to let it go, he said, and the question felt different from the ones before, less about control, more about understanding, and Evelyn gave a small nod, not dismissive, not indifferent, just certain. "I am not holding it," she replied, and the simplicity of the statement seemed to settle into the room with a clarity that did not fade. Derek's gaze dropped again, his fingers moving slightly against the table, tracing a line that was no longer there, and he let out a slow breath, his shoulders lowering as if releasing something he had not realized he was carrying. The older man in the corner leaned back fully now, his posture relaxed, his hands resting on the arms of his chair, and the boy by the window shifted in his seat, his legs moving again, though more slowly, as if the tension that had held him still was beginning to dissolve. The waitress stepped forward, her movements more natural now, less cautious, and she picked up a nearby plate, her attention returning to the rhythm of her work, though her eyes lingered for a moment longer than necessary before she turned away. Derek leaned back in his chair, the creak of wood soft beneath him, and he looked toward the man, really looking this time, not measuring, not challenging, just seeing, and there was something in that moment that seemed to settle into place, something unspoken but understood. "You could have made this worse," Derek said, his voice quieter now, directed toward the man, though it carried no accusation, only recognition, and the man gave a slight nod, his expression unchanged. "So could you," he replied, and the words were not sharp, not heavy, just true in a way that did not need to be emphasized. Derek let out a small breath, almost a quiet laugh, though. It did not carry humor, only a sense of something shifting, something easing, and he ran a hand along the edge of the table before letting it fall back to his lap. Evelyn watched him, her gaze steady, her presence unchanged, and for a moment, it felt as though the entire room had softened around that stillness, the tension replaced by something quieter, something more grounded. Derek looked at her again, his expression no longer guarded, no longer controlled in the same way, and he nodded once, a small, almost hesitant motion, as if acknowledging something he had not expected to understand. "You are different," he said, and this time it was not a challenge, not a question, just an observation, and Evelyn's eyes softened slightly, not in response to him, but in recognition of the moment itself. "No," she said, her voice calm, her tone even, "I just remember what matters," and the words settled into the space with a quiet warmth that did not need to be explained. Derek held her gaze for a moment longer, then looked away, his eyes drifting toward the door, toward the dimming light beyond the glass, and he exhaled slowly, his posture no longer rigid, no longer defined by the tension that had brought him here. The man stepped back slightly, not leaving, not withdrawing, just creating space, his presence still steady, still calm, and the room seemed to adjust once more, the balance shifting into something more natural, more familiar. Evelyn reached for the cloth again, her fingers smoothing it once before placing it neatly on the table, her movements returning to their quiet rhythm, as if the moment had passed, as if it had always been meant to pass this way. Derek pushed his chair back slightly, the sound soft against the tile, and he stood, not abruptly, not forcefully, just steadily, his eyes lingering on Evelyn for a brief second before shifting toward the door, and for a moment, it seemed as though he might say something more, something that would complete the exchange, but he did not. The bell above the door gave a faint, almost hesitant ring as it moved slightly in the draft, and the evening light outside had deepened into something softer, something quieter, and Derek paused just long enough to take it in. Derek stood there a moment longer than necessary, his hand resting lightly against the back of the chair he had just pushed away, as if he were deciding whether to return to it or leave it behind, and the quiet of the diner settled around him in a way that no longer felt tense, no longer sharp, but steady, like something that had found its place without needing to be forced. Evelyn Carter did not move to follow him, did not call out, did not shift her stance, her presence remaining exactly where it had been, grounded and calm, her hands now resting lightly against the edge of the table, the folded cloth beside them, untouched, as if the work had already been completed in more ways than one. The man who had entered earlier stood just a few steps back, his posture unchanged, his gaze no longer fixed on Derek but not fully turned away either, simply present, as if his role in the moment had never required more than that. Derek glanced once toward the door, the glass reflecting the dim evening light, then back toward Evelyn, his expression quieter now, the sharp edges softened into something less certain, less defined by control and more by thought, and for a brief second, it seemed as though he might speak again, might try to gather the moment into something he could carry with him, but the words did not come, and he let out a slow breath instead. The bell above the door gave a faint sound as it shifted slightly in the draft, not a full ring, just enough to mark the space, and Derek reached for the handle, his fingers pausing there, resting against the cool metal as if he were feeling its weight. Behind him, the diner had already begun to return to its quiet rhythm, the waitress moving between tables with measured steps, the soft clink of dishes resuming, the low hum of conversation beginning to rise again, not loud, not intrusive, but present in a way that felt natural, as if the room had been waiting for permission to continue. The older man in the corner unfolded his newspaper again, though his eyes lingered for a moment longer before returning to the page, and the boy by the window leaned back in his seat, his legs swinging lightly once more, the tension that had held him still replaced by something softer, something easier to carry. Derek opened the door slowly, the cool air brushing past him as he stepped halfway through, then paused again, his shoulder turning just enough to look back inside, his gaze settling briefly on Evelyn, who remained exactly where she was, her posture unchanged, her presence steady in a way that did not require acknowledgement. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, not long enough to hold, not long enough to define, but enough to mark the moment, and then Derek gave a small nod, not formal, not performative, just a quiet motion that seemed to belong more to himself than to her. Evelyn did not nod back, did not mirror the gesture, but her expression softened slightly, not in response to him, but in recognition of what had passed, and she turned her attention back to the table, her fingers reaching for the cloth, unfolding it with a small, practiced motion before placing it flat against the surface once more. The man stepped back further, creating more space, his presence no longer central, no longer needed in the same way, and he lifted his coffee cup again, taking a slow sip as if the moment had simply been another part of the evening, nothing more, nothing less. Derek stepped fully outside, the door closing behind him with a soft click, and the bell gave a gentle ring this time, clearer than before, marking his exit in a way that felt final without needing emphasis. The reflection in the window shifted, the inside of the diner becoming clearer again as the outside darkened, and the space he had occupied seemed to settle back into itself, not empty, not changed, just quieter in a way that felt complete. Evelyn moved to the next table, her steps measured, her posture steady, the faint scent of coffee and cleaning solution following her as she worked, her hands moving with the same care, the same precision, as if nothing extraordinary had happened, as if this moment was simply another part of a long day that would continue into the next. The waitress passed by her, offering a small, almost imperceptible smile, and Evelyn returned it just as lightly, a brief exchange that carried more warmth than words could hold. The older man turned a page in his newspaper, the soft rustle blending into the low hum of the room, and the boy by the window glanced once more toward the door before returning his attention to his plate, the moment already beginning to settle into memory. The man at the counter placed his cup down gently, the faint sound of ceramic against the surface marking the end of something unspoken, and he adjusted his coat slightly before stepping toward the door, not hurried, not delayed, just moving at his own pace. Evelyn did not look up as he passed, but there was a small stillness in her movement, a brief pause that suggested she was aware, that she had always been aware, and then she continued, her hands steady, her rhythm unbroken. Outside, the evening had settled fully, the last traces of daylight gone, replaced by the soft glow of streetlights reflecting off the glass, and inside, the diner carried on, quiet and steady, as if it had absorbed the moment and returned it to something simpler. Evelyn finished wiping the table, folded the cloth once more, and set it down gently, her hands resting there for just a second before she moved again, her breath even, her presence calm, and the room, in all its quiet, seemed to breathe with her.